For those that might not understand what we're talking about necessarily with the term egalitarianism
Mhm.
or complementarianism, do you think you can briefly define it for them? And then we can go into the criticism, the pushback that egalitarians commonly receive.
Yeah, so both of them are actually pretty modern terms, at least in the way that they are used right now. So complementarianism is a term that was really that began to be used in the late 1980s by a group of men, and they really were all men, who were some of the founders of the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, also associated with the founding of the Gospel Coalition, also some of the guys who were responsible for the English Standard Version. And they got together and decided that one of the most significant problems with the church today was that women were assuming leadership over men, and that women were not maintaining what they believed to be the calling on women to be subordinate to their husbands within marriage, as well as to not be leaders in the church. And so they began advocating for what they called complementary roles between women and men, but they're not really complementary because they always put women underneath men. So they're hierarchical, but nonetheless, they argue that God ordained men to be leaders in the home as well as in the church, and that God ordained women to be helpers, which they interpreted as being under the authority of men. And so they argued that God's plan for the best flourishing, and that's John Piper's word, of women and men, was to uphold this complementary arrangement between women and men, which they also argued was rooted in scripture and was countercultural. Egalitarianism is a term that emerged most famously with the CBE, which is the Council for Christians for Biblical Equality, which was founded at the same time that the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood was founded. So the CBMW, Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, promoted complementarity. The CBE, Christians for Biblical Equality, argued that God did not ordain a hierarchy between the sexes, that God actually used women and men in all sorts of giftings, and that God did not ordain a hierarchical arrangement within marriage, but that God actually sees women and men as both created equally in the image of God and worthy of having the same callings, called by God in the same ways. So, both of these terms, they're very recent, although there actually are historic uses, especially of complementarity in the past. And it's interesting that that term really first began to emerge in history in the 17th century with a secular, really not with a philosophical movement that argued that women were intellectually inferior to men and physically inferior to men, and therefore should remain within the household and not out in the public sphere and under male authority. And so you can think about, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the famous, philosophers, French philosophers who advocated for this. So complementarity is an older term, but it began to be used in this sort of new way in the 1980s. And new way, I mean, rooted in Christianity. They argued that this was a biblical model. And it was a direct response to what they called to Christian feminism. And they saw that the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, which advocated that women should not be treated differently from men in the law, in economics, in culture, et cetera, that women should be able to have the same jobs as men, the same pay as men, that there should be help in providing childcare for women so that they were able to work in the same ways as men, as well as healthcare for women, that women should not be fired from jobs for being pregnant or getting married, which was actually a common practice, and that women should have the right to equal pay. And so all of these sort of, advocating became associated with the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s. It was also tied with the abortion movement, which has played out somewhat today. But this response of Christians was that this fight for women's equality in the workplace, in the law, etc., was anti-Christian, that it was expressly non-biblical. And so you can sort of see the roots of complementarianism. Maybe, I mean, it's interesting as a historian to think about it, but with the fight among conservative Christians against the Equal Rights Amendment for women. And so you can see this playing out where there's this understanding that if you are godly, that you believe in the subordination of women to men. And if you are not godly, and if you do not take the Bible seriously, then you are for the equality of the sexes. Now, those terms, that term equality has gotten more complicated because we have the term now that we also use called equity. And there's an understanding that within feminism, that there are some women who are not able to have the same equality as other women because of their race, because they are Black women, because they are women of color, et cetera. And so now we have to think about both equity as well as equality when we think about the push for women to have the same rights as men.
Joy to